Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. This is not a perfect bill. Some say it goes too far. Others, including 2GB's Chris O'Keefe, says that it doesn't go far enough. The process of this bill coming to Parliament has been far from perfect. And while I appreciate the member from the other place, the member for Sydney has been working on this for a long time and with a consultative approach, it has been challenging to appropriately consider the final bill when amendments were not formally available until midday yesterday. The government's almost year-long delay on this has clearly contributed to the confusion. The manner of the bill's introduction to Parliament as an omnibus bill means that the range of topics, some highly contested, cannot be considered individually, which I contend would have been more appropriate given the gravity of some of the changes and for appropriate consideration of the further amendments that were made by the mover yesterday to receive support from the government. Nevertheless, here we are. What makes this bill particularly challenging to consider is that it deals with the rights of individuals, not only as individuals, but as members of groups, of tribes, women, trans women, parents, children, religious and incarcerated. Perceived or real, this bill has brought up threats to people's sense of security and respect, and the fear that overlapping rights will diminish an existing sense of self, identity and security. I'll cover the matters of birth certificate changes, commercial surrogacy, sex workers and people living with HIV/AIDS. It is obviously true to say that women have been fighting for space and for safe spaces in society for decades, centuries, let's say millennia. I honour the struggles and successes of the women who have gone before me. I appreciate their fight to expand our society so that women have opportunities and freedoms, not just like men, but for our own liberty, expression and comfort. I aim to contribute to that legacy. I want to protect the safety, security and strength of women. I feel powerfully that women have so many ways to demonstrate our strength in the world. Now the question we face, as women, is how we share those spaces with people who are different again, yet strive for acceptance, and how we accommodate additional nuance in our communities, whether gendered or otherwise. And what role does a piece of paper, government recognition, mean for a sense of acceptance and comfort? Well, we've been through the marriage equality campaign, and I have to say at the beginning of that campaign, I wasn't some sort of ardent supporter of marriage as an institution, but by the end, I truly understood the importance of an institution like marriage as a public declaration, as a way to offer a ritual around coming together and union that was publicly recognised and also recognised by the government. The best of liberalism, in my view, that extended a tradition and modernised it for the world that we live in today. It is an important piece of paper for those who it affects, yet it is very rarely interrogated by others. But of course, gender identity is more complex. I think it is harder to reckon with the idea that one might feel that they are born in the wrong body than it is to imagine that someone loves another person of the same gender. It is honestly hard for me to fathom because I only know the experience of feeling like and being born as a woman, but I am not gender dysphoric. I don't identify in that way. And regardless of whether I fathom it, I see that there are people who experience gender dysphoria. I don't think that it is a choice or that people should be denied its reality, their reality. At the outset, let me acknowledge the complexity of discussion around transgender matters. There is a huge variety of experience within the trans community about what being trans means and how that is represented. As a non-trans person, it can feel hard to say the correct thing, and sometimes it can feel very easy to say the wrong thing. But I hope that that doesn't prevent my earnest attempt to engage, also knowing that my observation doesn't excuse criticism of people who say very wrong things. Promoting unreasonable tirades based in bigotry is outright harmful. But maligning reasonable discussion about complex issues, such as the inclusion of transgender people in sport or safety based on physicality, is not going to help any cause either. And in a cliched but really heartfelt mea culpa, along the lines of some of my best friends are trans, I sincerely acknowledge the strength and vulnerability of my transgender friends and family members, and will always do my best to respect you. So how do we accommodate people who share their experience of being born in the wrong body and ask for help to live in this world that we share? How do we destigmatise being transgender? I fear that what society is largely doing now, excluding, sometimes attacking, and at some of the most vulnerable times, ignoring transgender people who experience high rates of suicide, poor mental health, and victimhood, will not improve without some legal recognition of the true experience of trans people, that they are compelled to identify with a different gender to the sex they were born into. We don't have good data on the number of trans people in Australia or New South Wales, and I can say in 2021, the non-binary sex option on the census form was marked by 43,220 respondents, or approximately 0.17% of the Australian population, which is up significantly from 2016, which was just 1,260 people. It is a huge jump, and I suspect it does reflect a social tendency at this time to consider that changing one's gender might be a solution to an uncomfortability or distress, whether social, physical, or psychological. This seems particularly prevalent amongst younger people, though the census doesn't reveal the age of respondents who mark non-binary. And of course, non-binary is not a term that necessarily captures people who are transgender. I hear from friends who are parents that they are dealing with questions of gender identity with their children, usually around 10 or above. At the rates we're seeing, it seems to be a fairly new phenomenon. Generally, I believe that gender fluidity and expression without medicalisation or formalised labels can and should be accepted without fuss. Young people, particularly for young people questioning their gender identity. I say it again because I think it's important. I believe that gender fluidity and expression without medicalisation or formalised labels can and should be accepted without fuss. Some gender norms can confine us, and particularly women, to gendered power imbalances, a stunted sense of identity, and a limited ambition for ourselves as individuals, as much as in groups in the world. Seeking a sense of certainty and control in the world is always an enticing furphy, but exploring the different aspects of our identity at all ages can and should be a curious, fun, and perhaps sometimes slightly terrifying experience. But I strongly believe it should be encouraged in a safe, respectful, and compassionate way. Gender identity isn't everything, but it can form a big part of how we see ourselves and our role in the world. I stressed that all of this does not conflict with my view that true gender dysphoria and transgenderism is very real and is currently associated with some shocking statistics. According to research collected by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, a 2017-18 survey of Australian trans adults found that 43% of participants had attempted suicide in their lifetimes. In 2016, the Trans Pathways Survey of Australian trans young people aged 14 to 25 years reported that 48.1% of participants had ever attempted suicide. These are terrible figures with our fellow Australian stories behind them. The 2021 study of Zwickel concluded that suicidality is associated with desiring gender-affirming surgery in the future, gender-based victimisation, and institutionalised cis-sexism. Interventions to increase social inclusion, reduce transphobia, and enable access to gender-affirming care, particularly surgical interventions, are potential areas of intervention. This bill reflects some of these suggested interventions to reduce suicidality for transgender people and other social harms. Do I have reservations, fears that people will exploit this system? I have fears about people exploiting our social systems and legal programs every day, that certain people will seek to impose upon others, and particularly women, for their own ends. And this obviously and horribly already exists, and unfortunately routinely at the hands of current or former intimate partners. However, I'm not convinced that in Australia it happens routinely, systemically, or commonly at the hands of trans women or trans men. I understand that there is no published data in Victoria on complaints or prosecutions in Victoria where changes to birth certificates have been legal for 5 years, because there have been 0 complaints or prosecutions. I've been told that the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner has said that there have been no complaints in Victoria since instituting the law, and no prosecutions or formal allegations along these lines. And I note that discretion in decision-making around women's spaces is still a reasonable part of our legal and social frameworks. For example, in New South Wales prisons, A person who self-identifies as transgender has the right to be housed in a New South Wales correctional centre appropriate to their gender or of identification, unless it is determined through classification that the transgender person should more appropriately be assigned to a correctional centre of their biological gender. Unfortunately, the reality here is that a 2022 Australian study found that transgender and gender diverse people are the ones who face systemic abuse in Victoria's criminal justice system. Published in the International Journal for Crime, Justice and Social Democracy, the La Trobe University study of 42 participants shows that transgender and gender diverse people have been subjected to sexual and physical violence, harassment, abuse and neglect in all areas of the criminal legal system, especially in prisons. When I've spoken to Domestic Violence New South Wales, they've told me that their member organisations, who provide services every day to some of our most vulnerable women, including trans women, always deal with admissions to their services on a case-by-case basis, and this bill would not change that, and that is appropriate. In public spaces like women's bathrooms, I have to say that I've never been asked for my birth certificate to enter, and I note that obscene exposure is still a criminal offence, stating that a person shall not, in or within view of a public space or school, willfully and obscenely expose his or her person. In dealing with issues like the Coogee Women's Baths, which gained some media coverage a couple of years ago due to questions of access, I understand from public reports that community members are now engaging with a range of organisations and individuals to manage everybody's needs and wants, including the trans community, the Muslim Women's Association, the Council of Jewish Women and the Swifts netball team to make the pool as welcoming and inclusive as possible. These are human-scale problems, and there are human-scale opportunities to engage with and expand the spaces available to all of us. We have to work together if we're going to deal with our shared reality. I do want to note that the process for changing a birth certificate under this bill requires a statutory declaration to be made, for which knowingly falsifying a stat dec carries a penalty of 5 years in prison. This is a serious offence. Are there other approaches that could have been taken, like in other states, or distinguishing between a birth certificate as a historical document and an identity document for contemporary use, or to include additional options in the sex descriptor on a birth certificate like transgender female or transgender male? Perhaps there are, and these questions could have been addressed more fulsomely with a better process of amendments through Parliament. I also want to note the opening statement of the Australian Government Guidelines on the Recognition of Sex and Gender, adopted in 2013 under the Abbott Coalition Government, that the Australian Government recognises that individuals may identify and be recognised within the community as a gender other than the sex they were assigned at birth or during infancy, or as a gender which is not exclusively male or female. This should be recognised and reflected in their personal records held by Australian government departments and agencies. And this is the same document that reflected the change to passports. That's how people could identify as a gender different to the one that they were born with on a formal government document. Ultimately, I want a world where the stigma associated with being transgender is gone. It dissipates. I know that transitioning has changed the life of my cousin, who is now happier, more vibrant, more comfortable in the world. And I also want to live in a world where being a woman is not an inherent safety risk and that being a woman is celebrated. I've said before in this place that some people care about other people's sexuality far too much, and I would argue that the same can be said about other people's genitalia. However, I don't want to be flippant either. People who have experienced trauma and feel vulnerable around certain bodies should also feel safe and protected. We must all come at this with a deep sense of respect and compassion for personal experiences. This is a human-scale experience and interaction with others, which we may not ever understand fully from the other perspective. These discussions about gender go to the heart of a deeply human experience. On commercial surrogacy, I want to firstly acknowledge that it is clearly happening. Many of us are aware of Australians engaged in this process who want to start a loving family despite the barriers. However, data on arrangements is limited to non-existent. In 2016, the New South Wales Government made a submission to a federal parliamentary inquiry stating that there is no reliable data on the number of children in New South Wales born as a result of international surrogacy arrangements. This is an issue that affects a range of people, including same-sex and heterosexual couples and individuals. But most importantly, it affects the children who are left in legal limbo without appropriate parentage orders to grant them access to recognition and benefits. These and legal protections. These are the people we need to protect most. Children should not be limited in their opportunities because of the decisions of their adoptive parents. I would suggest that given the reality of our system, where people are clearly engaging in commercial surrogacy arrangements with overseas countries, it would have been preferable to utilise the resources of the Modern Slavery Committee recommendation and commissioner to determine a list of well-regulated jurisdictions, perhaps like Canada, and a list of poorly regulated jurisdictions where exploitation is a risk, so that Australian couples or individuals could feel more confident engaging with an international process of commercial surrogacy. Regarding updates to the sex worker provisions around dependence and coercion, we now no longer have the amendment relating to coercion, but my understanding is that these amendments were sought by stakeholders, including the Scarlet Alliance, with moving testimony provided by those with lived experience to the Parliamentary Committee which examined the Equality Bill. And finally, I believe that the definitional updates to the old term HIV infected are reasonable and appropriate for those living with HIV today. Seeking to destigmatise health conditions is always a good thing. I will never say that these matters are easy to grapple with. The reality is that there are significant differences of opinion on this challenging bill, and I believe we have a responsibility to tackle them together. I want to thank the very wide range of stakeholders, the groups and individuals who have reached out, met with me, called and had conversations. I truly appreciate all of your time, interest and engagement. Most importantly, I do not believe that we should demonise difference or act in bad faith when considering matters like this. Though a piece of paper can make a difference to an individual, we can't really rely on legislation to effect widespread change in attitudes and behaviours without social engagement. The only way through is to continue to meaningfully engage respectfully and keep talking on a fundamentally human scale in our communities. Finally, I want to sincerely acknowledge the strength and vulnerability of my transgender friends and family members. If you are trans or are thinking about what being trans means and need to talk to someone safe, please get in touch with a GP or call a helpline like Beyond Blue or Q Life. Life isn't always easy, but there is hope and joy in life. You are not alone.